I was thinking about it when y'all reached out to me, and I was like, what is my story? And I don't know that I necessarily have one, but I absolutely do have a series of characters or figures that I was drawn to, that I was like, oh yeah, a definite homosexualist, uh, from some circa like 19th century dandy aesthetic that I've managed to cultivate from like 4 years old to present.
Always keep coming back to some common threads. I mean, I think just broadly the fantasy genre has been a big common thread, for any number of reasons. What's another great? I mean, within that, Buffy, I think a lot of folks were
I
drawn
bet
to the.
that's
Yeah, that's a big one.
yeah, I bet. I mean, the shows like that though are all about awakening. Like so, sci-fi awakening, being able to, in some cases, again, I'm immediately outing myself as somebody who doesn't really know pop culture. Excited to be on the show. Either Star Trek or Star Wars. It's Star Trek, isn't it? Where there's this character, maybe Data, who's able to switch genders. Could be Deep Space Nine. I'm gonna move forward. It's not my analogy to make, but basically, I know there's a lot of. I mean, my sci-fi example would be Doctor Who, that I've also been watching almost as long as Murder She Wrote. Now the Doctor is a woman, but also is she or are they is my own non-binary insertion, because I don't know. Do you know Doctor Who?
I mean, I know the basics certainly, but haven't
One of the
watched.
longest sci-fi shows, British, supposed to be a man in a telephone box, which is the TARDIS spaceship throughout time and space. But the Doctor is able to regenerate, which is like an ability for, obviously, actors to take over the role and let it exist for decades, but also is a way to sort of think about the many facets that we have inside of ourselves, because each Doctor has a slightly different personality, right? They're not trying to be the same guy or person now. And I don't know, I'm already on a tangent, but I really appreciate sci-fi shows like that that are able to be like, well, who can you be now? Or when can you be? Which I really appreciate in terms of thinking like time and space, in terms of my own like coming into myself, the kind of person that I want to be, or definitely was. Like I was 90 if I was a day. If you asked my family about how I showed up in the world and how I'd like to you know, give advice to people 8 times my age, or knit and sew things, and, you know, talk about aches and pains. You know, I was either in my past self a Jewish grandmother, or just some other kind of curmudgeonly figure. I don't know.
I love this idea. I mean, just speaking broadly, that I've come to a number of times in these conversations of being drawn to pop culture that I think we maybe, especially the younger age, we know is meant for an older audience or not for us. I think it's so fascinating because there is so much pitch to kids and whatnot, and yet there's still many instances where yourself and where I've been like, yeah, but that doesn't really apply to me. I don't see myself in this, and so we have to find it elsewhere. And sometimes it is in Murder She Wrote. It's like
It definitely is in Murder She Wrote. Let me tell you about this show, which I am always dying to do for people. I used to live in New York, and I had friends who would do like a drinking game or just like a betting game. Like that would take me, how long would it take me to bring up Murder She Wrote or something Dame Angela Lansbury related? And I don't have a good track record, so I would always bet against myself, just to put it that way. So I'm really honored to be doing this on purpose. The show aired in 1984, September. I also aired around that time. Uh, so it felt like destiny for me to really watch this show throughout my life. It's really a show that often people are like, it's a show for grandmas or aunties, but for me and a few people of color that I know, especially Black people, those are the people who raised us, right? Or those are the people who we were sat at home with or caring for in different kinds of configurations. I watched the show because my grandmother watched the show, because my aunties watched the show, and because as a child, I didn't have, what's the word, opinions or rights. So I would mostly watch whatever they had on in the afternoons while they were sort of engaging in what I now think about as like, you know, like feminine sociality, right? My grandmother is a part of a rosary club, but they would basically, it's basically like a stitch and bitch, you know, they would just knit together or sew together, talk shit about each other as husbands or sons together. And that's really how I learned to sort of, well, first of all, mind my business, and so, but also in this like weird meta sort of way, while watching these like old ladies, old aunties and grandmas sort of engaging in community and camaraderie and also caring for one another and the parts of their community and households, watching this auntie who did literally the same thing. And that was Jessica Fletcher on Murder, She Wrote, who never had any children of her own, but was very much a doting, diligent aunt and took no shit from anybody and would be very much, just sitting quietly in her ability to be everything, like she would just sit there or smile or give a witty retort, and then she'd be able to just like tell you all about yourself. It was, for me, before I knew reading was a thing, it was exactly that. And I just knew that I loved everything about her. I don't know, I knew it from then. So Murder, She Wrote was my entry, but then being Dame Angela Lansbury, right, she has a 7-8 decades long career, and so I just sort of backtracked and figured out everything that she was a part of, which turned out to be a lot of camp, a lot of glitter, a lot of musicals, and every aspect of my non-binary homosexuality was ignited in that moment. So
one point from that being, a lot of it being camp and glitter, and I wondered if we could dive into that a little bit more. I mean, what are some of those specific examples that kind of came to mind there? Why do you think Angela Lansbury and this idea of camp go hand in hand so well?
What a question, my friend. I'm having like a flash forward and back of all these visual memories. One awesome example of her doing something, and when I say camp, I don't know, I know that these words migrate over time and they take on more and more expansive meanings, which I usually am super excited about. I really mean the sort of like classic Hollywood era glam, glitter, and elegance that also had within it like a real community spirit, right? So it's not a kind of camp and flair and glamour that is always oriented towards the self, but really, really community oriented. I mean, Angela Lansbury in Murder, She Wrote, I'm only gonna say the phrase Murder, She Wrote a dozen or two more times, put on so many of Hollywood's and Broadway's, West End's greats, but also erstwhile greats, right? Like the show, she was on the other side of middle age, and she put on those people, right? It was the young, self-centered, conventionally attractive, able-bodied white people who were seen as like ditzy, or that she and the other aging aunties and uncles had to rescue out of crimes, right? Like, because they had somehow found themselves trapped and caught up, and she had to say, no, let's do this together as a community, right? I think that, so I wanted to be clear that that's like, I mean, this kind of camp and kitsch for community's sake, if that's possible. One thing that comes to mind that she recently, a couple of years ago, reprise is her role as Madame Arcotti in Noel Coward's Blithe Spirit, where she plays a psychic, and she is completely bedazzled in glitter, but it's supposed to be, the sort of whimsical, drawing a lot of cabaret style, person that is, I don't know, whimsy is something that also, as I'm thinking about it, it's maybe less camp, which somehow I feel like in the 21st century takes itself super seriously at times, with the whimsy that I think I was really mystified by and taken with as a child. All of that's really funny because I come across as super self-important and self-serious now. I'm an academic, I got these glasses, who knows if I really need them. I do, I need them, but but there is something about the ability to sort of like let go and be whimsical and don some feathers, put on some glitter, that I think I'm still really motivated and captured by, if that makes any sense.
Of course. I liked also that you wanted to clarify this, like this camp built in the idea of community. I think that's so fascinating. And I'm also tying it into what you kind of initially were saying about why you were drawn to Murder, She Wrote, because it felt like it was part of it was like the Stitch and Bitch community that you were like raised adjacent to.
But I've actually never had like a precise coming out moment. And this is not to shade the the American polity of queers. Thank you for letting me be amongst your ranks to a certain degree, but I've never, grew up partly in the Caribbean, partly in Britain. My family's from Costa Rica, UK, Jamaica. And that's just not like, that was not a narrative that I had. There was not like a moment where I had to sit someone down and just say, mother, father, this is it. And then even like reap the negative parts of it, right? Like there was something, there were like, also, being assigned female at birth, I think there was also something that is like more antagonistic to femininity than anything else, just in society, patriarchy, globally speaking. But that being the case, because that being my condition, I never really had to like, I think, for example, in Jamaica, it would have been harder to be, assigned male at birth and then adopting feminine traits or attributes, basically. And so for me, it was like, okay, yes, I'll sit here and do the knitting and do the sewing. And I really took the domestic activities, right? Now that we're in this pandemic, I'm gardening and sewing and making my own clothing and face masks. And it's not like I had to learn that in a, prepper boot camp. I've been doing it since I was a child. There was there was like a blur between, I don't know if I'm making any sense or rambling, but for me there was really like this more amorphous divide between what gets perceived as masculine and what gets perceived as feminine. And all that to say that the drawing and the desire for community and the desire to also be at times ostentatious, but like having that be sort of whimsical and compassionate and all of these other things that why I like, for example, cabaret and these kinds of performances. And Dame Angela Lansbury was huge in terms of cabaret and vaudeville, is where she got her start, and her family got her start as well. I don't know, they for me all go together. For me, it just feels like a much more amorphous divide, such that I guess I'm already undermining what it is that I initially said in the self-deprecating way, in terms of like, on the surface, it may not make sense why I really love this Catwoman, especially so a show like Murder, She Wrote, especially something like Sweeney Todd, or these like camp, larger than life characters that get played either feminine but campily so, or kitsch and clumsily so, where I don't identify with womanhood as such, and I don't identify with like systems of binary gender as such. But for me, it also proves the point, right? It's like the quote unquote exception that underscores the rule of like being multifaceted and also having a desire for softness, but also a very strong discernment that, for example, Jessica Fletcher has, right? She didn't take any bullshit, and she was definitely, at the height of her femininity, play a drinking game where someone is not trying to sleep with her in every episode, and I mean, you'll be wasted, right? You'll need a new liver by season 2. And so I feel like, I don't know what I'm saying. All of those things feel to me really connected. Yeah. Also, sometimes we just need just like a bit of whimsy, but also I did also want to underscore the like the discerning, right? There's something just supremely both elegant and empowering in being able to say, first of all, elegant, empowering, and like in banter. I think that's one of the things that I learned. And so if there was any community, I don't even know if it's niche or necessarily queer community in part really, but for me, one of the things that I drew from the show, from Murder, She Wrote, from Angela Lansbury's career, is really not to find a similarly labeled community of folks, but like a disposition, right? Like people who were really willing to and able to entertain, and to have that not be something that is just thought of dismissively, right? So it can be whimsical, but also it needs to be incisive, right? People are not, I mean, I don't know, again, 21st century, there's a lot of reality television and etc. But it's, it takes something to entertain people. I'd like to think, right? It takes something like compassion, something like knowing a bit of yourself, a bit of people, a bit of I don't know, what it takes to show up and try on new hats, right? And I think that's something, at least in my community of friends, in my community of organizers, and also in myself, the ability to sort of, while definitely being a Virgo and not spontaneous, unfortunately, still being able to like want to reach out and be of service by trying new things for others, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. I too am a Virgo, so
Oh, good. I don't understand.
I totally understand that.
It's like I don't want people thinking like, oh wow, essays just lied on this whole thing because they're not whimsical. I know I'm not whimsical, but like I will, in order to be of service, will sort of try new things, you know, like strike up a new conversation or sort of like use my desire to like craft and develop and like put that on, right? We're all performing. And again, I'm sorry to be a professor about this, but we're all performing things like gender all the time, right? And so being aware and then wily and then turning that on its head, I feel like it's exactly what Angela Lansbury has done her entire career.
Of
Gaslight
course.
the present.
So I'm curious, what are your feelings on the dame distinction? I mean, specifically in terms of Angela, but then, I mean, what does that mean to you even in the broader sense beyond her?
Yeah, so this is a tricky part for me. We all have contradictions, right? Gloria Anzaldúa talked to us about sustained contradictions, and I am going to absolutely misappropriate that for this, just to say that while I am a Republican in the British sense, I want to just say that again, so that means that I'm not Republican here. Maybe you can edit that out. I just don't want to confuse anyone. But that means no monarchy, right? Just to be clear, a republic, not a monarchy. And so that basically means no dames.
Right, so where have we found ourselves?
Yeah, no, I following out the sentence. Sorry, oh no, the sentence kept going on in my head, but I started getting emotional. Yeah, you know, it's really tricky. I'm not really sure what to say about it. A lot of the time, if we're talking about what it means to like come out or whatever that means for anybody, right? If we're talking about what it means to like come into is what I prefer, right? Come into ourselves or be able to name ourselves freely or name ourselves as free. That is already a really sort of magnificent and awesome feat, right? And so I think that what makes it awesome, like filled with all sense, is that we are in a world that doesn't want to see most of us alive. And I know I'm saying that in a pandemic where a lot of people are, you know, are impacted in these sorts of ways, but this world is an oppressive one, right? It's white supremacist, it's patriarchal, it's transphobic, it's ableist, it's fat phobic, it's so many other things, anti-indigenous, right? But if that means that those people, the people that are impacted the most by those acts of oppression, so the trans person, the indigenous person, fat person, disabled, like all of these sorts of people, we don't get to then like cut ourselves off of being able to imagine ourselves into certain spaces and times, right? That, I mean, that has to be something that is obvious to those of us who like media, right? Like who even if it is sci-fi, like we were talking about, who are liking things from people in 3000 whenever, the Romulans and the whomevers that don't necessarily exist, although I regret saying that in case nerd Twitter will come for me because they do exist. We have to have an imagination. And that's, I mean, what I have to say about the Dame question in a very tangential way is that, right? What we have is the imagination. And so my ability to sort of imagine myself having traits in common, being shaped by interpreting myself in the lives of these kinds of novels, TV shows, poems, whatever, is something that I think is what gives me my power, because it also allows me then to imagine, you know, I'm shockingly not a 60-year-old white woman from Cabot Cove, Maine, who doesn't have a driver's license but can solve any murder anytime, anywhere. And yet, what I can do is learn about what it means to, again, be discerning, be in touch with my own femininity, be in touch with my ability to be independent, but also be in touch with my ability to sort of draw on community and support people. And so all of those things can happen with a person that is still definitely a white cis woman and a member of a community such as Dames that sort of reupholds a monarchic system that literally oppress my people, and I have to just sort of like take those apart.
Mm-hmm.
I can't sort of keep them together. I feel like Dame Judi Dench, Dame Angela Lansbury, is Helen Mirren a dame she ought to be? You know, I feel like these people are also, you know, represent something in one level, but also that doesn't take away individually, not structurally, with what they can do or how they sort of mobilize or agitate other parts of our coming into ourselves.
Of course. I mean, I think a role that sort of speaks to this is Manchurian Candidate. I think in the way that it's like we're projecting one certain identity, but we're also fully undercutting that and subverting it in some ways.
Yeah. Also, I mean, Manchurian Candidate is actually indicative of so many roles that Dame Angela Lansbury has played that that is what makes Murder, She Wrote so incredible. I know this is not just about Murder, She Wrote. It's really hard for me. But what makes that show so incredible too is that she for most of her career played stone cold bitches. That's just it. One of the campiest, another good example of camp. Oh man, do you like musicals? Another good example of camp is she played Mame, the titular Mame, in the 1969 musical against B. Arthur. Listen, if you haven't heard the song Bosom Buddies, I mean, I'm happy to recreate it for you when the lighting is more in my favor.
Right.
It's both about friendship and just stone cold bitchery that I think really encapsulates most of her. She was effectively typecast for a significant part of time, but what was great about that is she plays whatever is the feminine version of avuncular in Jessica Fletcher, right? She is there to sort of extend an arm and show up, but there are like snippets and kernels and layers to her being like, but don't fuck with me though. Like, I'm gonna allow you to think, because of things like patriarchy and ageism and all these sorts of things, that you've got one over on me, but just you wait. In about 27 minutes, I will tell you that one thing that you said, or that slight sleight of hand, or that little glance that you did, is what lets me know that you're the murderer. Now, yes, Cameron, you may be saying, well, SA, aren't you an abolitionist, or don't you hate the prison industrial complex? Yes, I do, but I want to see her put them in jail. You know, it is also why a lot of people I know who are activists around sexual assault and sexual violence are like begrudgingly watching Law and Order Special Victims Unit. You know, like that goes hand in hand too with our imagination, right? There is a space, regrettably in SVU's case, run by the police, but there is a space in the world where justice can be sought.
And you mentioned also that Sondheim is kind of a recurring presence in your life. Where's that what draws you into the works of Sondheim?
I'm so sorry. I chuckle because I'm just thinking, it's hard for me to get out of my own head, and I'm thinking about how all of this is gonna come across, and I'm just like, let me tell you about all these whites that I love. Musicals for me, so in addition to, a pretty rural upbringing in parts, like in Jamaica, for example, I was very much drawn to basically I was a really moody bitch. I don't know how else to say it. Like, I was the youngest, but with age gaps, I was often by myself and or with very old people. And so when I came into my grandfather's collection of vinyls and things of that nature, then I realized oh man, there's whole genres that my peers are not playing or not into, but are speaking right to the heart of how it feels to be alone. Do you know what it means to be alone? But then I was like 12 and I didn't know what it meant, you know? So that was effectively how I got on this path. And someone like Sondheim, you know, I have really mixed feelings about, in terms of how uh, uh, in terms of composition and direction and all sorts of things. But a musical like Company, for example, is something that comes to mind a lot. In fact, is the song Being Alive, which my favorite version of which is sung by Rola Sparza. It's on Spotify. Is something that I play after every breakup, only because I like to remind myself what it means to like feel something, what it means to like want to. It's actually like a poorly timed song, because if you ever listen to it, Being Alive is, you know, at the end, the last song of the musical Company. And the protagonist, Bobby, is sort of really deciding like, oh, this is what it means to want someone and to be wanted, right? This is what it means to sort of talk about coming out or coming to one's own, right? This heterosexual 60s cis man is coming into sort of deciding not to be such a loner, to really need people and want to be needed. And that's what it means to be alive. And he says it in this very, you know, sardonic and ironic and also heart-wrenching sort of way. And so I play it at the end of every breakup to sort of remind myself that that would have been nice. That's effectively it. It's like, that would have been nice. There it goes. And so I sort of really appreciate the sort of ironic possibilities of that particular Sondheim play. But I really also am drawn to his storytelling, right? And how that happens on a sonic scale, right? Effectively, music, storytelling plus song, right? To be super, super reductive about it. But what I appreciate about it is the way that Sondheim challenges his everybody, challenges the audience, challenges the singers and performers. Songs like from Into the Woods, where he's skipping over whole scales and going into all sorts of minor keys. So it's basically a desire to like love and create something beautiful, but then also have it not be easy, right? And that's really, you know, Cameron, why I'll Die Alone, but also why I'll do that with a flair, right? So I'll be very, very difficult to be around, but with style and grace. Stephen Sondheim uh, has been sort of one of the mainstays, mostly because, I mean, he just turned 90. His career has been incredibly long, and is also his impact on other musicals, I think, is what I'm also drawn to, right? There is a certain sound and a certain sort of musical challenge in the way that he composes his songs that I think will outlast so many others. And in that same way, I'm happy to circle back and connect it to Dame Angela Lansbury, who, of course, was Mrs. Lovett in Sweeney Todd, the musical, which Stephen Sondheim begged her to do. I mean, literally campaigned for her. And if you can imagine that, right? Like, there's obviously been many reprisals of, I guess Helena Bonham Carter did a turn. You know, others have tried, but no one is as great as the Queen. I have elevated her from Dame, and I think that's the only way to do it. You know, to be so coveted because of her work ethic, because of her talent, because of her style, and because, you know, as we say, game recognizes game, right? So Stephen Sondheim, who was well in his bag, who saw Angela Lansbury and was like, but no, you actually have to play this role, and I've made these songs for you and your vocals. I think it's not even just flattering, it's more just like a recognition of greatness, and also the ability to sort of pull together a musical, right? Because she's not Sweeney Todd. He didn't write Mrs. Lovett the musical, but that was also unnecessary if you hear the way that she inhabits the role. And again, as I was saying earlier, in terms of coming into myself, one of the things, especially moving to California, is recognizing how important astrology is to people in the queer community, not least. And so one of those traits in terms of, like, again, being of service, showing up, being dependable, doing practical things, right? But also making it fashion, right? That's something that I think that even though Angela Lansbury is a Libra, that's okay. She's still in her roles, shows up in these kinds of ways, right? She can be the sort of second string character, even from her very, very first role in Gaslight, when she stole the show and people were like, give this person Hollywood, you know, like give her all the things, when she would just be a maid literally lighting the gas lights in the film Gaslight from 1944, I think it was. There's something striking to me about how someone like Sondheim would want to sort of take that character and have it shine in its own place, right? How to shift the orbit whenever that kind of person is on stage. And I think that takes just like a lot of skill. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about camp, but not in an egotistical, self-centered way, right? Camp for the community, right?